Welcome to another episode of the Cartoon Curator. On this episode, we're going to delve into the most intriguing and possibly the most important character of the golden era of animation. A feline that wowed audiences before Tom and Pink Panther ever existed. A cat that always had a bag of tricks to make magic. The character that I speak of is none other than Felix the Cat. So, what led to his creation? And how did Felix's rise into the world of animation come about? Also, to understand the creation of the character, I will delve into the lives of two men who are actively responsible for that character in the first place, and the controversy behind the character as well. Also, we will look into his run as a cartoon star, and we will answer the question like I always do. What is Felix the Cat's relevancy and influence today in the world of animation? These questions and more will be answered today on this episode of the Cartoon Curator. The year is 1914. This would be a year of new creative endeavors, the burgeoning of the film industry, and also animation would take place at the center of it all, New York City. Well, not quite. Actually, it would take place on the other side of the Hudson River, in a city called Fort Lee. In case you are wondering where Fort Lee is, it's in New Jersey. Yes, that is correct. Fort Lee, New Jersey. To think that New Jersey was actually the epicenter of both industries around this time would be quite the revelation, but this was the case nevertheless. In fact, many citizens of the town would appear in several of the productions made there. People could be seen walking around town in costume at any time of the day. Just imagine a whole city where almost everybody in it were employees, and you would get the gist of it. Many would stake their claim here, including one that is very familiar to viewers of the series so far. Carl Laemmle. Yes, that Carl Laemmle. Well, when I say many, what I really mean is studios. In fact, by 1915, it had gotten to a point where guys like the great Louis J. Selnick were producing a whopping 4 features a month. It would also house productions from D.W. Griffith, Oscar Mitchell, and the legendary actor-director Lionel Barrymore as well. So to say that this place was the lifeblood of the industry would be quite the understatement. The allure of Fort Lee burgeoning scene would attract all sorts of people, including the famed comic illustrator Winsor McCay. Now, if you don't know who Winsor McCay is, he should be familiar to some. More on that in a second. Anyway, Winsor McCay would also dabble in another form of art that was just becoming popular at the time. animation. Windsor wanted to make his mark, so he decided to throw his hat in the ring in 1911. Now, here's where he should be familiar to some. Here it is. Okay, let me reiterate better. See, Winsor McCay made waves as a comic strip illustrator with his hit comic strip Little Nemo in Slumberland. This character would make an appearance on silver screens 78 years later with 1989's Little Nemo Adventures in Slumberland. But here in 1911, it would be Little Nemo's first animated effort. Just like the comic strip, it wowed audiences. Windsor knew that he had something going on here. He would follow it up with 1912's How a Mosquito Operates. Many were wowed by his newfound prowess. Word had spread like wildfire about his animated efforts. As much as they were impressed with this short, Windsor would make the next evolution in animation in 1914 with his third short, Gertie the Dinosaur. It was a spectacle marvel at the time, as it would implore almost lifelike movement to the character. But the icing on the cake was when Windsor himself would appear behind the screen, giving the dinosaur commands from a crack of a whip. It was nothing short of genius. Many of those in attendance at the Hammerstein Theater in New York would be in awe. But there would be one young man sitting in that audience that would be enamored and inspired by what he saw that day. His name was Otto Messmer. So, who is Otto? Well, this is where our true story begins. On August 16, 1892, a machinist by the name of John Messmer and his wife Thekla, a silk mill worker, would give birth to their second son, Otto, John Jr. being the first, of course, in West Hoboken, which would be 5 miles away from Fort Lee, by the way. Since his birth, Otto would take after his father, who was generally mild-mannered, hardworking, and gentle, as his background, along with his family, would be that of the Roman Catholic faith. As a schoolboy, he would learn to write and draw. He would soon take a passionate following to the latter. In fact, him and the other students from his class would exhibit their drawings publicly. Otto knew drawing was the path for him. After leaving school, he would take an art course and attend courses in the evening at the Thomas School of Art in New York. Even though he learned to hone his craft, he really didn't like the direction he was going in terms of his art. See, the school mostly taught drawing for fashion design. He would dabble in doing that kind of art, but this isn't where his heart lied. He wanted to draw cartoons instead. As a young man, he would also take a liking to theater as well, due to his mother and aunt taking him to see vaudeville shows. This would make him want to paint scenery for theater, and he would for a while. But soon, he would be intrigued by another medium, movies. Otto, along with his brother John, would visit Nickelodeon's. No, not the channel. I should cover it. Anyway, Nickelodeons were small theaters where you could view movie and newsreels in them, and you would pay a nickel. These would further intrigue the brothers to see more films, so they would attend a show where an animated film was being shown by none other than Winsor McCay, of course. Upon seeing the film, Otto was definitely enamored, and he would attend to see his second film, and then you know the rest. Otto now knew his path, and he was determined to get to his goal by any means necessary. He took the initiative by putting in the work. He began drawing cartoons and would shop them around to various newspapers and magazines at the time. He would soon get a big break, as the New York World publication would give him a shot, making strips for their Sunday comic supplement called Fun. There, he would develop his style and also take up other interests such as writing funny poems. Both of these ventures would give him the confidence he needed to make that jump to the next stage of his life. Otto would make that attempt by writing several letters to Jack Cohn. Now, who is Jack Cohn? Well, he was quite the important man at the time. See, he was the heart of the newsreel department for a company we all know today as Universal Pictures. Otto's persistence had paid off as he would be given a job as a set painter. Well, that's the position that he had applied for. This position would change into something better after he made a great impression on Jack with the artwork he had done previously, especially one in particular. It would be a flipbook. Jack was so impressed with this flipbook, he told Carl Laemmle about it and they had ideas. See, around this time, cartoons were starting to become a huge deal. Guys like Winsor McKay and Emil Cole, who had made waves with animated short films such as The Puppet Master's Nightmare, were becoming the next big thing. Universal wanted a piece of that as well. Jack had an idea. He saw something in this young man, so he decided to take a gamble. He wanted cartoons to accompany the newsreels, so he decided to sign Otto to a contract to create a single test film. This is the break that Otto had sought out. Without hesitation, he went to work on this first project. But this was the thing. Otto didn't have no idea how to animate. He didn't have any knowledge of cells, a method that John Randolph Bray would devise in 1914, by the way. It employed the use of celluloid acetate. He didn't even have the PEG system. Otto didn't have any of them, but he did have one thing they both didn't have: a supportive father. Otto's father would build him an animation drawing board for him. It wasn't the best of equipment, but it did allow him to manage to create his very first animation effort called Motormat. Otto knew that he had something special with these drawings, so he took it to Universal. To make a long story short, Motormat was liked by Jack Cohn, but it would never come into fruition. But it didn't matter, because Jack would show these drawings to two men that had frequently used the facilities. Little did Otto know, these two men would propel him into a venture that would cement him to animation stardom. Otto decided to take his career even further than before. This was it, his dream, there right in his grasp. Oh, let's get to these two men that I mentioned. Well, the first would be High Mayer. He was a very important figure in the business, as he would be a well-renowned cartoonist and actually had a major role in the infancy of film itself. But there's one thing he definitely wasn't renowned at: animation. See, he didn't know much about animation at all, past drawing cartoons for various newspapers and publications. But Otto took a shot with High nevertheless, and him being close buddies with Theodore Roosevelt also helped his case. Yes, the 26th President of the United States himself. In fact, this is the reason High wanted Otto in the first place. He wanted him to make an animated film about Teddy Roosevelt. Well, actually a series of films, as they would both work together to create the travels of Teddy. High and Otto proved to be a great pair, but Otto grew enough confidence to go out and grow further, so he went to seek out work from the second man Jack spoke of. This man would be Patrick Sullivan. Now Patrick, or better known as Pat the Most, would be quite different from High. Whereas High Mayer was eccentric, Pat was very far from that. In fact, he was definitely rough around the edges. Born on February 22, 1885 in Paddington, Sydney, New South Wales, Australia, Pat was the second son to Patrick Sullivan, a longtime cab driver and Margaret Sullivan, of course. As a child, Pat would instantly take a liking to drawing, despite his mother wanting him to pursue music instead. But Pat was determined to pursue his dream of being an artist nevertheless. He would get his start with drawing cartoons for The Worker for a while until the age of 22, where he would leave the pastures of Australia for London. Pat's time in London wouldn't be as fruitful as he thought it would be. For a while, he was sleeping in the streets under bridges just trying to sell off his drawings. Eventually, he would make an earning and would move into a place. This is where he would develop a habit that would factor heavily into his life: drinking. Definitely more on that later. Anyway, Pat would also dabble in other ventures due to his drawings not selling too much. These included acting on stage and as a motion picture exhibitor, both of which he would unfortunately flop at. Pat figured London couldn't offer what he had wanted, so he left for New York City. If he thought his misfortunes in London was the last he would have, then you would be incorrect. In fact, he would work as a mule tenderer on a ship and take up boxing. You have to remember, this was the early days of boxing. In other words, it would be a mess of a stint that lasted just as long as it began. Figuring that boxing wasn't for him, his next path would lead him to the Clore newspaper syndicate, where he would go on to work with William Mariner as his assistant. Mariner would be known for working on kid strips. So what are kid strips? Well, they were comic strips that always had a kid as the protagonist. These would be very popular at the time. Winsor McCay would have the previously mentioned Little Nemo in Slumberland. Rudolph Dirk had the Katzenjammer Kids. Yes, them again. What can I say? It's all about the Katzenjammers. But Mariner would be at the head of the pack. He would have several comic strips at the time, including The Jobs of Jasper Jenks Jr., and one that had gained him the most notoriety: Sambo and His Funny Noises. Pat and William would instantly become two peas in a pod. This was due to both of them having two things in common. The first was that their art styles were very similar to each other, so it freed up a lot of stress on Mariner drawing the strips by himself. The second was their love of drinking. And I ain't talking about water. Anyway, Pat would also create his own strips at the publication, along with working on Mariner's strips. It seemed that all was well. Until October 9th, 1914. On that day, William Mariner would be found dead in his Hackensack, New Jersey residence. The mystery behind what happened is quite unknown, but there's one detail that wasn't. Let's just say that his other love would be the catalyst that would lead him to his demise. It was a dark day indeed. Especially for Pat here on out. He tried to continue on with the Sambo comic strip, but with his lack of writing talent, it caused the comic to be discontinued. But Pat had other ideas. Just like Winsor McCay before him, he wanted to dabble in animation, so he aligned himself with Raoul Bari, an emerging animator and quite the innovator in the field as well. In fact, remember when I mentioned the PEG system? Well, it would actually be Raoul who invented it. Pat would join his studio, but as you can tell by now, when it comes to Pat, his tenure at the studio wasn't a success. He would be fired after only 9 months at the studio due to his work being subpar. But also with Pat, his ill determination didn't allow him to be deterred from his new goal, to open up his own animation studio. His logic? Hire the best talent and let them do all the labor. So this is what he did when he opened up his own studio in 1915. By 1916, Pat would be in a decent place, and lo and behold, Otto would show up at his door looking to work with him. Here was Otto, a man who despite being hardworking had no experience, looking for a shot in the business and still lived with his parents. And you had Pat, outgoing, a man who lacked pure talent but made up for it with cleverness and was rough around the edges. An odd couple indeed. What these two would do next would rock the animation space to its core. Otto's tenure at Pat's studio would be well underway during the remainder of 1916. He finally found a place where he could hone his natural talent for animation with someone that had experience in the industry. So it's easy to say that admiration was bestowed upon Pat by Otto. But things wouldn't start out too easy at the studio. Upon arriving, it was already short-staffed, so Otto had to work with what he could. Pat's craftiness would drive them to his next project, Sammy Johnson, which just happened to be, well, let's just say this. It was basically his rendition of William Mariner's Sambo comic strips. In other words, he would totally rip off Sambo. Luckily, he wouldn't be hit with any copyright infringement. And on top of that, he would also see moderate success with the shorts. This allowed the studio to make other shorts such as Fearless Freddy and Willie Slate. These two shorts would be a showcase of Messmer's growing talent as an animator, but it would be their next project that would take them to another level. That year, they would be tasked with bringing none other than the man almost solely responsible for the birth of silent film comedy, Charlie Chaplin, in animated form. Long story short, this cartoon would become several tunes as it would be a success for Pat and Otto. Otto had finally started to develop his own personal style and philosophy on animation. This growing confidence and proficiency would carry over into 1917, but this year wouldn't be without its trials and tribulations. For Otto, it would start out great as he would meet his future wife, Ann Mason. But Pat, on the other hand, would head downhill as he would be embroiled in a scandal involving a 14-year-old girl. Pat, along with his friend Ernest Smythe, would be arrested on a rape charge and an abduction charge, respectively. This would actually come about when an employee working there would tell the two girls involved to speak with an acquaintance of his. She would see something on one of their clothes that didn't seem right. One thing led to another, and Pat would be fighting for his freedom. Mind you, around this time, Pat was already engaged to a 29-year-old native of Scranton, Pennsylvania by the name of Marjorie Gallagher, less than 2 weeks prior. In fact, she would actually write to the judge by giving him leniency. Unfortunately, his fate would be decided in the courts, and he would be sent to a place where he belonged, prison. He would be sentenced to almost 2 years. Well, shorter than that. We will get to this in a moment. Meanwhile, Otto went about his business and went on to work with High Mayer. Yes, him. And guess what? He would have his own studio around this time and employed many of the former employees from Sullivan's studio. He would also give Otto a position that he would have never thought he would achieve in a lifetime, being the head of a department. This was a man who went from just drawing strips to animating films and now to being a boss. But unfortunately, this wouldn't last due to another event that would happen around that same year, World War I. Otto was drafted to fight on the front lines. It would be a love for his family and wanting to get back into the animation space that kept him going. This experience definitely shaped young Otto into something different, and when he came home, he was primed to get back into the thick of things, And he would do just that alongside Pat Sullivan. That's correct. See, Pat would only serve 9 months of his sentence. Determined to leave the past behind him, Pat would reopen the studio and almost immediately picked his business back up. He was also primed to get back into the thick of things, considering all he did while he was in prison was draw. Pat and Otto would kick things into full gear in 1919. First off, they got back to working on the Charlie Chaplin cartoons and other projects as well. But one day, a man by the name of Earl Hurd would show up at the studio's doorstep. He was in charge of a visual publication called the Paramount Screen Magazine. He wanted a short from them for his publication. They would oblige. They would conjure up something very unique. Here it is. Lo and behold, Pat Sullivan and Otto Messmer's effort, Feline Follies. This short would be quite different from the other shorts they had done previously. First, it would star a cartoon cat named Master Tom, by the way. Second, it came about through lots of hard work and Otto's keen knowledge of pantomime. His experience on the Charlie Chaplin shorts was definitely on display in this short, along with elements from the Sammy Johnson shorts as well. The character would display similar traits to both characters, but it still maintained its individuality. Feline Follies would also showcase an aspect that would definitely be brand new at the time, the metamorphic sight gag. For instance, the character's tail would transform into a question mark. A black mouse drinks a carton of milk and it turns white, and even Tom's tail, along with his lady friend, turned into scooters. It was unlike anything seen up to that point. Unfortunately, Otto's time on the front lines of World War I would also creep into this short, as well as the main character would actually die in some way at the end. This was definitely different from anything seen in animation, considering cartoons were initially made for adults in mind. But also, Master Tom would not be the first cartoon feline to ever grace screens. That distinction would go to George Herman's Crazy Cat shorts. But what Feline Follies did was make the character a bona fide success. This in turn would be followed up by their second short, Musical Muse, that same year. But it would be their third short that would be the most important, as it would introduce the audience to his new moniker, Felix the Cat. By 1920, Felix the Cat would become a runaway success, which led to a contract with the famous players and Lasky Corporation to do more shorts in conjunction with the Paramount Screen Magazine. Okay, let's address the elephant in the room. Anybody who is even remotely familiar with Felix the Cat knows of the controversy. If you don't know what I speak of, well, let me tell you. What I'm referring to is who actually created Felix the Cat. Before I start, I would like to say that this assessment is from reading and researching various sources, books, and records. Also, I pride myself in getting every ounce of info that can be presented to you. With that said, let's examine. First, what you should know is that prior to Feline Follies' debut, Pat's studio already had done a short in 1917 called The Tale of Thomas Cat. This short is quite important as it would also star a feline. Now, this would be enough to say that he created Felix, but as previously mentioned, the concept of a cartoon feline was already invented by George Herman, and this would be 2 years prior to The Tale of Thomas Cat's inception. 1915 to be exact. But this isn't even the case. Also previously mentioned, Pat wasn't particularly skilled in animation. This is why he would be let go from Barry's studio in the first place, because of his unsatisfactory performance. But this would be the catalyst for him to start his own studio, as he believed that getting the best talent to do the work for him was key. As for Otto's role in this, he was the one who drew and animated the Charlie Chaplin cartoons, so his proficiency in animation was blossoming. Also, when Earl Hurd came to the studio about doing a short for them, Pat initially did not want to do the project. This was due to the massive workload the studio was experiencing at the time. Pat would tell Otto if he wanted to do the project, he could come with something on his spare time. And Otto did just that. What would he conjure up? A black cat, as he thought it would be the easiest thing to draw and get out quickly. With that said, you can take this info and make your own determination of who created Felix. As 1920 pressed on, the success of Felix the Cat would carry the studio into 1921. This is where things would get interesting. See, the president of Famous Plays Lasky, Adolf Zucker, had wanted to shut down the operation due to it being so expensive to maintain. This decision would not sit well with Pat. First off, he didn't even own the rights to Felix. They did. So naturally, his next course of action was to approach Zucker about getting the rights back. But things would get messy. Supposedly, Pat was drunk when he visited his office. Let's just say that the whole interaction between these two was rather unsavory, and leave it at that. Nevertheless, it did make Zucker relinquish the rights back to Pat. Now Felix was without a home. But this wouldn't last too long. Someone else would be interesting in taking on the rights. M.J. Winkler. They would broker a deal with one another. Now, who is M.J. Winkler? Ah, M.J. Winkler. She was quite the lady. Oh, that's right. M.J. was a woman. Her name was actually Margaret J. Winkler. She was quite the interesting pedigree. She previously worked as a secretary at Warner Brothers and wanted to branch out on her own. So this would make her the first woman to ever own an animation production company. Mind you, this was the 1920s. It was almost unheard of to see any woman in a workplace doing business. But Margaret did just that, albeit disguising her name for obvious reasons. Margaret would be the right partner for Pat because she would be the one that kicked things into full gear for the studio. Otto would work diligently to produce work satisfactory to the New Deal and to M.J. Winkler. He did just that, starting with 1921's Felix Saves the Day. First off, it would be longer than the previous shorts before it, clocking a bit over 7 minutes. Also, the cartoon would employ the use of live-action stills and footage cross-cut with the animation itself. It was very ambitious to say the least. The cartoon was about Felix trying to save a team from losing a baseball game. The style of the previous shorts would carry on to this one like the metamorphic traits of Felix himself. Felix Saves the Day would be a huge success for the studio, and Felix as a whole. In fact, there would be merchandising such as dolls and toys that would adorn his image. Even advertisements. Felix Mania had swept across the nation. He finally reached cartoon superstardom. With its runaway success, more cartoons would be made in the span of 1922 with a plethora of shorts such as Felix at Sea, Felix Gets Revenge, and Felix in Love. But it would be Felix Turns the Tide that would stand out the most. Even by today's standards, it would be quite dark. How? Well, in the cartoon, Felix is at war. Obviously, this would stem from Otto's time in World War I. The cartoon would have images of explosions, bodies of deceased felines along a battlefield, and even Felix being shot from a cannon like a cannonball. But at the same time, it would maintain its absurdity, such as an army of wieners marching into battle to fight alongside Felix. It was quite morbid, but nevertheless, the short would display all the characteristics that Felix would be known for, such as pantomime gestures and his calculated approach to situations presented his way. This would differentiate Felix from the cartoons at the time. Audiences across the country couldn't get enough of the Felix shorts. In fact, by the end of 1922, Felix was on a fast track to become a household name. So it's easy to say that Margaret was not only pleased with the receptions that the shorts were getting, but also she got a lot out of her investment. In fact, she would resign Pat to a new contract to make more cartoons. Much more. So that meant Pat, alongside Otto, would have to bring in new talent. But there would be one particular artist Otto had brought in that would change things. His name would be Bill Nolan. Who was Bill Nolan? Well, Bill was quite the animator. Having worked for Barry Studio, an International Film Service animation studio prior, Bill would be known for his efficiency. See, Bill always tried to find ways to cut the workload down, and it proved to be an asset on his behalf, since he was known to produce more drawings in less time than any other animator in the field. He would apply this expertise almost immediately, as he would be responsible for Felix's redesign. The redesign would come about simply due to Bill not being able to draw Felix as he was. So, what would he do for the character? Well, for one, he eliminated Felix's snout. Second, Felix would now sport a more circular design. This would make Felix more fluid in movement through a use of an animation technique Bill employed during his time at IFS Animation Studio. Rubber hose. Otto had liked what he had seen, so he approved it. And thus, the Felix the Cat we would come to know and love would be born. Felix the Cat's success would continue on into 1923 and throughout the remainder of 20s. But along the way, the shorts would start to reflect the era, such as the burgeoning of jazz and the Prohibition. On top of that, Felix would make its debut in comic strip form in 1923. It seemed that Felix was everywhere. Well, not entirely. See, MJ Winkler knew Felix had star potential, so she decided that she wanted to take Felix on the road. And when I say on the road, I really mean over the pond. She would make a deal with a film distribution company called Paith that were housed in London. More on that in a moment. During that time that the comic strip was being debuted, Pat and MJ, along with her fiancé, were having a contractual dispute. You should know who he is by now, watching this series. Yes, it's none other than Charles B. Mintz. Anyway, as you know with Pat, this wouldn't bode well. It came to a point where he wanted to distance himself from MJ Winkler. This was due to Pat feeling that his cartoon series was worth more and wanted to raise the price of them, and MJ's tactic to pay the same amount she paid previously for more cartoons initially. Pat would try to distance himself from her, but MJ would prove to be a shrewd businesswoman. See, Pat would take his services somewhere else, and when MJ found out, she did something insane. She put out a newspaper ad that basically staked her claim to Felix. Long story short, nobody wanted to touch Felix after that. But it would prove to be an effective strategy because Pat and MJ Winkler would eventually come to an agreement to continue on with the shorts. Around that same year, Pat would also make a trip to a place he was quite familiar with, London. He was back where he had started, but now things were very different. He wasn't that vagabond journeyman trying to survive on his drawings. No, he was now a successful animation producer with the biggest cartoon property of the day. And I do mean big. Upon MJ's distribution deal with Paith, the Felix the Cat shorts had become a huge hit in London. But the success of Felix over in London didn't please Pat in the slightest. Felix was being used for advertisements and merchandise without having Pat being credited for it. Even the distributed films didn't have his studio's name on them, and the excessive autographed illustrations he did for people he felt didn't appreciate Felix further infuriated Pat. He felt that Felix was being exploited and he wasn't gaining any compensation for it. So, as soon as he got back to the States, he immediately demanded royalties he felt that he deserved from Paith. But truthfully, this would be the least of his troubles. See, upon arriving back, things kept rolling on, and with something that is popular as Felix comes competition. During his time away, a slew of new projects would come out of Winkler's operation, including one done by a man who would emerge to become a rising star in the animation field. Walt Disney. Here, he would come with the Alice comedies. One thing that I had forgot to mention as well is that Winkler didn't only distribute the Felix shorts in the Alice comedies, she would also distribute another series of shorts from another man we discussed in the premiere episode. Yes, it's none other than Max Fleischer, and these would be the Out of the Inkwell series. Why I mention this series is because Alice would employ a reverse method that the Out of the Inkwell shorts employed. Alice would be the first real human side of a cartoon world. It was nothing short of brilliant, but one of the shorts would introduce a character that would infuriate Pat. Julius the Cat. Let's cut to the chase. Julius was a direct imitation of Felix the Cat, even down to the metamorphic traits of his tail. Pat had had enough, and he sought to distance himself from Mintz and Winkler for good. So, his longtime lawyer, Harry Kopp, would set up his own company called Bijou Films so him and Pat could rake the profits for themselves. To prepare for the future, Harry would sail to London to shop off Felix, and as we know about Felix's reception in London, this wasn't a hard sell to say the least. On top of that, he would make a new deal with a company called Educational Films Corporation of America to distribute the series after their contract with MJ was up. But this wouldn't sit well with Winkler and Mintz. Despite Pat and Harry taking action during the end of the contract, they still decided to sue them. This time though, MJ Winkler would be on the losing end. Pat finally got his freedom from MJ Winkler's operation. But the real winner of this battle... Okay, by 1925, Felix would start gaining even more steam as his popularity in London had grew. With their new partner, Ideal Film Company, Pat would be welcomed with open arms as they rolled out the red carpet treatment for him and his wife, of course. Finally, Pat would get to show the Felix shorts the way they were intended to be seen. See, the shorts were previously stripped down into chapters when Paith had the rights to them. Now, the new shorts would be seen in its entirety. This would be the same in America with Educational Films Corporation as they rolled out their media blitz. Felix would be riding high around this time, and the quality of the cartoons would be among the best of that era, particularly with 1925's Felix Trifles with Time, which had Felix dabbling in the fantasy realm for the first time. The cartoon would even pay homage to Winsor McCay as well, as it featured a dinosaur that looked very similar to it. Other shorts such as Felix the Cat in the Cold Rush had him teaming alongside Charlie Chaplin. Otto was on a roll with the quality being pumped out of the studio. From crafting stories to actually basically directing the shorts himself, the team were pumping out 2,500 to 3,000 drawings per short. That was quite the task, but Otto's expertise had fully grown to an expert level by this time. Business was definitely booming for the studio. They would even bring on Raoul Bari into the fold. Yes, the man who gave Pat a start in animation. Barry would fall on hard times and he lost his studio. So as a gesture, Pat gave him a job at the studio. This would be a great asset because with the presence of Barry, the team would improve upon their animation starting with 1926's Felix the Cat in Tulips Time and 1927's Felix the Cat Dines and Pines. They would even experiment with the shorts with 1927's Felix the Cat Hits the Deck, as Otto and his team would employ real-life objects into the animation. Film Flam Films would have Felix venture into the subject of the filmmaking process, as the premise had Felix and his young kins trying to enter a movie theater and ultimately end up ruining the film playing in the theater starring Felix. This would be one of two that would dabble in something meta. 1928's Comic Calamities would be the second. This one would definitely be something Rudolph Ising would have been proud of, as it actually had Messmer drawing the character for those watching the short. The studio would produce the best work they had done up to this point, but during those years creating those shorts, a new innovation was making its debut on movie screens. As previously mentioned in the series, it would be the debut of the film The Jazz Singer that would rock the industry, as it would be the first film to ever have voice dubbing. This would be in 1927. Here was Felix in 1928, and things would get dire for our feline. As 1928 pressed on, Felix would maintain his reign in the animation space, but the advent of voice was looming ever so slowly. More of the other studios, such as Van Buren, which we'll touch on in an upcoming episode, and Mint Studios were adopting synchronized sound. In fact, Van Buren would do just that with 1928's Dinner Time, but it wouldn't be on the level of what was seen in The Jazz Singer. But on November 18th of that year, audiences would finally see it implemented on a grand scale. What was the short? Well, remember when I said that the real winner of the battle was someone else? Well, without further ado. Yes, that's right. It would be Walt Disney's pivotal creation, Mickey Mouse, in his debut, Steamboat Willie. Long story short, it was a game changer, as it would be the first short specifically made for synchronized sound. Walt, alongside Ub Iwerks of course, had achieved the impossible, and audiences loved it. Now that you know who is the real winner of the battle, you are wondering how he was the real winner. Well, let's go into that, shall we? With the reception of Steamboat Willie, Walt Disney set the industry into a frenzy. This was the next big thing, and everybody wanted to follow suit. Walt knew that he had something, so he wanted to grow his base even more, so he went around to every studio he could to recruit, including Pat Sullivan Studios. And guess who he came to recruit? It shouldn't be a hard guess. It would be Otto, of course. Walt would try everything to get him on board, but Otto's loyalty didn't allow him to be swayed. Besides that, he also felt that Felix was going quite strong, and him not wanting to move out west also played a factor in his decision. But Walt would actually sway someone else there, and that man would be Burt Gillett, who was quite the experienced animator himself. This would be a sign of things to come. And by the way, these two would go on to do great things together. But that's a story for another day. Otto would be right actually, as Felix would continue on in excellent fashion. The shorts were at their best as they ever could have been, particularly with 1928's Felix and Sherlock Holmes. This short had Felix in a forest at night, trying to escape a ghost that takes form of a shirt. It employs the use of black ink in interesting ways, such as the sky being filled by blobs of black to create a nightly sky, several shadows chasing him in the house, and the use of shadow as Felix walks past a window in the house. It was a spectacle even back then. It would definitely be the culmination of the work they had done up to this point. But despite that, Educational Films Corporation wouldn't continue their contract with Sullivan. This was due to Sullivan not wanting to have Felix speak. He absolutely refused, since he believed Felix was doing great, so why change? Well, this would be a grave mistake. First off, the studio would experience layoffs, including Hal Walker, who worked with the studio since the beginning of Felix's run. Times were dire for the studio. Pat knew he had to take action, so he found a new distributor, Copley Pictures Corporation. He decided to change his stance on sound as well. Not exactly. The result of their partnership would come in the form of Skulls and Skulls in 1929 and April Maze in 1930. The latter had Felix with his kins trying to have a picnic, but it keeps being interrupted by a rainy weather god and a bunny and bear trying to steal their food. The animation was still top-notch, but the short lacked the charm that they were known for, and the audience had seen it. On top of that, their transition to sound wasn't met with open arms by the viewing public as well. See, they went with post-synchronized sound, which meant it was recorded after the cartoon short was done. Audiences seen it as a lazy attempt, as they were being accustomed to silly symphonies that Disney were also producing at the time. Felix started to lose traction in the eyes of the public, as Mickey Mouse had started to become the next big thing. Around this time, they would produce Felix the Cat, Woo's Whoopee. This short had Felix at the club trying to have a great time with his other cat friends drinking. It had dancing buildings and lamps that turned into smoke-blowing dragons. The cartoon was nothing short of a visual marvel. But alas, it wouldn't make any difference because everybody had moved on from Felix. By 1931, the studio was finished. Felix the Cat's reign as a star had all but ceased. This would drive Pat Sullivan into a spiral. His refusal to change with the times and complacency ultimately did Felix the Cat in. There was one thing he could turn to at a time like this to ease his pain: the bottle. And that he did. But losing the studio wouldn't be what ultimately broke him. On March 26, 1932, Marjorie Sullivan would fall to her death from her second-story window, landing headfirst. It was speculated that she committed suicide, but it would be later deemed an accident. Nevertheless, losing his wife and his studio would drive him into a deep depression. On top of that, he would be straddled with another problem. See, Pat would also contract syphilis. Now, how did he get it in the first place? Well, there's only one way to get it. I will leave that up to you to determine. Anyway, by this time, Pat wasn't the man that he was before. He slowly started to deteriorate. On February 15th, 1933, Pat Sullivan would pass away from chronic alcoholism and syphilis. The era of Felix the Cat as a star was over. This was the 30s, and things were changing in the animation space. Otto would have to find a new place to continue on, and he would do just that. But little did Otto know, new things were on the horizon for him. I would love to thank you all for watching. Unfortunately, I had to stop here. This would be the end of his reign as a cartoon star. But it wouldn't be the end for Felix. On the next episode, we will conclude as I delve into what became of Felix post Pat Sullivan Studios. I thoroughly enjoyed making this episode for you all, and it was quite the task. Oh, if you haven't subscribed, please do so. Also, please press that like button and click that notification bell so you can be informed about future episodes. I want to continue taking this journey through this gallery with you all. With that said, this is where I have to bid you all farewell for now. Come back as we conclude the history of Felix the Cat on the next episode of the Cartoon Curator. Till then, Godspeed.